Do you remember the thrill of exploring ancient castles filled with gothic horrors, battling vampires, skeletons, and all manners of creatures? And at the heart of it all, one infamous name, Dracula. Released in 1986 by Konami, Castlevania defined what it means to create a horror-themed action-adventure game. With its whip-wielding protagonists and iconic enemies, it laid the foundation for one of gaming's most enduring franchises. Today, we're revisiting the origins of this classic series, and we're going to take a look at its long-standing legacy. So grab your holy water and prepare to slay some vampires as we dive into the world of Castlevania on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 213th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we're diving into the origins of the world of Castlevania, a franchise that began in September of 1986 and continues to this day to redefine what it means to create an action platforming masterpiece. And today, we're going to look at its 8-bit editions. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who swings his whip just as often as Simon Belmont. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, so what would be your favorite weapon for taking down Dracula? Whip, holy water, or maybe a garlic pizza?
Well, Dave, everyone knows you got to chop off a vamp's head. So, I'm thinking like a machete or something similar.
A machete?
Yeah, you got to chop off the head, and the best way to do it is machete, a sword. Swords are getting a little heavier and harder to conceal, though.
I thought that the lore was you had to put a stake through their heart.
Depends on which lore we're talking, Dave.
That is very, very true. I knew you were going to say that. I think in reference the lore for this one. No, I stand corrected. I thought about it.
Did you?
Yes, I sat here and I thought about it for a brief moment, and for reasons that we're going to talk about in this episode, I was incorrect. So,
All right, fair enough.
spoiler alert. All right, well, before I get to that fun little teaser and we talk about Castlevania, let's talk about what else has happened during this week in gaming history.
All right, kicking it off on September 23rd, 1994. Looking Glass Technologies released System Shock for MS-DOS, a game that would go on to become one of the most influential titles in the history of video gaming. System Shock was a groundbreaking first-person action-adventure game that combined elements of RPGs, immersive simulation, and narrative-driven gameplay. Set aboard a space station in the year 2072, players took on the role of a hacker who must thwart the plans of Shodan, a malevolent artificial intelligence. The game was praised for its atmospheric world, deep gameplay mechanics, and complex storytelling, all of which were way ahead of its time. System Shock laid the groundwork for future immersive sims and inspired many subsequent titles, including the BioShock and Deus Ex series, making it a seminal work in the gaming industry. We learned about the System Shock series back in episode 207, so if you'd like to learn about how important this game is to gaming history, give it a listen.
Yes, indeedy. That wasn't that
Yes.
long ago. Do you remember that episode?
I do. That was pretty recently.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. It's kind of weird.
It's all right. I won't wax poetic on an episode we just did, so you can let us know what else happened during this week.
Will do. On September 26th, 1995, Westwood Studios released Command and Conquer for MS-DOS, a game that would become a cornerstone of the real-time strategy genre. Set in a near-future conflict between the Global Defense Initiative and the Brotherhood of Nod, Command and Conquer introduced players to fast-paced, resource-based warfare, where strategic base building, unit management, and tactical combat were key to victory. The game was praised for its engaging gameplay, cinematic storytelling, and multiplayer capabilities, which, for the time, were groundbreaking. Command and Conquer not only popularized the RTS genre, but also spawned a highly successful franchise, making it one of the most influential and enduring titles in video game history. And we learned about it in episode 105, so go check it out to learn more.
That was a little bit longer ago.
Halfway through our time ago, some
It
just some time.
was a little bit ago, 100
Yeah,
weeks.
but go
Oh,
listen and learn about how that's the only game my dad played regularly for years.
Command and Conquer?
Oh yeah, Red Alert. Come on.
Yeah, I know. Red Alert was fantastic.
All right. Anywho, next up on September 24th, 2002, Microsoft officially acquired Rare Limited, marking the end of the iconic British studio's long-standing partnership with Nintendo. Rare, known for developing some of the most beloved games on Nintendo platforms, including Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye 007, and Banjo Kazooie, had been a second party developer for Nintendo since the mid 1990s. The acquisition by Microsoft for $375 million was one of the most significant in gaming at the time and allowed Rare to develop games exclusively for Microsoft's Xbox platform. This move ended an era of collaboration between Rare and Nintendo, which had produced some of the most memorable titles of the 90s, and shifted Rare's creative output to a new generation of consoles under Microsoft's ownership.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty crazy acquisition.
What have they done with it?
Couldn't tell you.
Okay, well, then I won't tell you.
Oh, darn. Well, that's sad. Maybe there's a place you can find out.
Yes, old episodes.
Yeah. On September 22, 2006, Avalanche Studios and Eidos Interactive released Just Cause for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC, introducing players to the explosive open world action adventure game that would become a hallmark of the series. Set on the fictional tropical island of San Espirito, Just Cause followed Rico Rodriguez, a skilled operative, as he aimed to overthrow the island's corrupt government. The game was praised for its vast open world, stunning environments, and the freedom it gave players to approach missions in a variety of creative and chaotic ways. Just Cause stood out for its emphasis on high octane stunts, grappling hook mechanics, and vehicle based action, laying the foundation for a successful franchise known for its over the top action and massive open worlds. We talked about the actual inspiration for Just Cause back in episode 5, so go check it out if you want to learn about it and Revolution.
Yeah, Operation Just Cause was a real thing, and we learned about it
Way, way, way back.
way, way, way back when I was still getting my footing about how I wanted to format this podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
3 years later, on September 22nd, 2009, Bungie and Microsoft Game Studios released Halo 3 ODST for the Xbox 360. This standalone expansion of the Halo series took players to the streets of New Mombasa, offering a fresh perspective by placing them in the boots of an orbital drop shock trooper instead of the iconic Master Chief. Halo 3 ODST featured a more atmospheric, noir inspired theme, focusing on stealth and exploration as players pieced together the story of a squad of ODSTs separated during a Covenant invasion. The game was praised for its engaging narrative, unique gameplay elements, and the introduction of the cooperative multiplayer mode Firefight. Halo 3 ODST was well received by fans and critics alike, adding depth and variety to the beloved Halo franchise. And Dave actually played it for the first time, and we talked about it as a topic on episode 56. So go check it out if you'd like to learn more.
Yeah, go check it out because I gave my opinion.
Yeah, which normally is pretty biased and bad, but hey, maybe it's not in that one. You'll find out.
Okay.
Great game, though, in all honesty. Last up for this week in gaming history, on September 28th, 2011, The Binding of Isaac was released for PC, created by indie developer Edmund McMillan and Florian Himsel. This dark, roguelike dungeon crawler was inspired by the biblical story of Isaac and featured procedurally generated levels, randomly dropped items, and permadeath, giving each playthrough a unique and challenging experience. The game's grotesque yet captivating art style, combined with its deep gameplay mechanics and the sheer variety of power ups and enemies, made it a standout in the indie gaming scene. The Binding of Isaac quickly garnered a dedicated fanbase and critical acclaim, becoming a highly influential title in the roguelike genre and leading to several expansions and remakes, including The Binding of Isaac Rebirth.
Rebirth, which was a really good remake of the game.
I'll take your word for it, Dave. Never played the original or the remakes. So,
You'd
yeah.
you'd probably really like Binding of Isaac. It's you don't play a lot of roguelikes, but you really like challenging games, and it really fits the bill.
Ah, so you clearly hated the game.
Yeah, despised it. Can't stand it. Can't stand it. Rob, it dawned on me while I was sitting down to do my research for this episode that I don't know if we've ever really talked about the history of Konami, the company that created Castlevania. So I thought that maybe we could start with a little brief overview of the very beginning. I'm not going to get too in depth on it. One of the company's founders, Kaz Kozuki, he ran a jukebox rental and repair business for some time. Kind of the way Sega started too. Sega was into, I don't know if you'll recall, but they did jukeboxes too. So he had this jukebox rental slash repair company, and as electromechanical games increased in popularity, he decided he wanted to change into that industry to become manufacturer of amusement machines for video arcades. And so the company was incorporated with that in mind under the name Konami Industry Company Limited on March 21st, 1965. Konami, as a name, is a portmanteau of its three founding members, the aforementioned Kaz Kozuki, Ko, Yoshinobu Nakama, Na, and Tatsuo Miyasako, Konami. So it's the first two letters of the last name of its three founders. So if you never knew that, now you do. Little fun fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for some years they made mechanical games, and not surprising, now they make like slots and pachinko machines and stuff like that. So the fact they got their start there should be no surprise. But as coin operated arcades became more popular, like everyone else, Konami decided that they wanted to get into the action. And so in 1977, towards the end of 77, they finally released their first arcade cabinet, and that was a game called Block Yard. And it was followed shortly thereafter by a game called Block Invader in 1978. Real creative names we got going on here. And really throughout the 80s, they released a number of really well known arcade cabinets, one of which is Frogger, that we covered back in episode 72. They released Time Pilot, they released Gyrus, they released Qbert, Gradius, they released Contra, which we tackled back in episode 25. That was a fun episode, Rob. Remember we learned all about the Konami code? It was like I did a history of cheating based around that game.
Yeah, it was Contra. 2 up, 2 down, left, right, BA start.
That's
Well, 2 up, 2
exactly
down,
right.
left,
The
left, right, left,
Konami
right,
code.
BA start. So,
But
don't come at me.
we looked at other ways people cheated too, like the game genies and I think the PC engines in the modern age. So that was a fun one. Oh, and the early Easter eggs that people put in, like the code in Cave um, Adventure, Colossal Cave Adventure. There's the word I'm looking for.
I thought it was Cave Story.
Now we did that later on, though.
That's the one I thought you were talking
we're,
about.
we're getting to the point where I'm like, ooh, we did it. Ooh, we did it. Ooh, we did it. Ooh, we did it.
Well,
That's
because we
great.
did it.
We did do it, I know. In the midst of all this, in 1985, a programmer named Hitoshi Akamatsu first worked on a vertically scrolling shooter called Finalizer Super Transformation. In this era, video game developers credited themselves not with their actual names, but pseudonyms, right? Now, we've talked about this before. The thing of it is that the video game companies, Konami, Nintendo, etc., 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 they didn't want their employees to put their actual names on video games because they felt that then competitors could identify their employees and poach them. So they didn't want credits. So these video game developers basically were working around that by putting pseudonyms, nicknames for themselves in their video game credits, right? So, because of this and something else that we're going to talk about later, we don't know much about Akamatsu's career. We've kind of pieced it together from little bits and pieces, from interviews with other people. There are different ways we piece it together, but it's spotty at best if I'm being honest with you. This was one of the more difficult ones to do some research for. Some of the other development teams that Akamatsu was noted as having worked on, he worked on the Time Pilot, the arcade version of Time Pilot that I just mentioned. He also worked on a game called Surprise Attack, which was released shortly after Time Pilot. So he had a little bit before him as a director slash programmer. But as the popularity of the Famicom began to take off after its release in '83, all these coin operated arcade manufacturers began to take note, and they really wanted to capitalize and dive into the home markets, the console markets, because they recognized that the home markets was going to eat into the arcade market, and everyone wants money, so why not make it work for them, right? So Akamatsu was given the opportunity to direct one of the games that Konami was going to produce for the Nintendo Famicom. Now, people who have worked alongside Akamatsu has said that he was an admirer of cinema, and he walked around the Konami office bragging about movies. There's a good anecdote about how, for a long time, he bragged about how good the movie Alien was. And no joke, there are some that believe that this is why Contra has a lot of influence by H.R. Giger. And if you don't know how Alien and Giger come together, we talked all about that in an earlier episode. Just go search for H.R. Giger. I don't remember the number right now, but we looked at one of his video games and we looked at his career. Video game he helped design the art for in his career. We covered all of that and how he is responsible for the design of the aliens in some respect. And so you would know H.R. Giger even if you don't really know H.R. Giger. So
Yeah, because I sure didn't.
now you get how they go together, though, huh?
Yeah, it makes a little more sense now. But, go give that episode a listen if you want it to make even more sense. Ooh.
So Giger's love of cinema drove him to approach projects with a film director's eye. He would approach the visuals and the music of his next project as a project made by people who are consciously wanting to do something cinematic. And in terms of Castlevania, it meant that he wanted players to feel like they were in a classic horror film. Because of this, that team worked that team that worked on Castlevania, rather, they borrowed very heavily from classic monster movies, the kinds made by Universal Pictures and Hammer Film Productions. There are enemies in the game borrowed from them, like werewolves and zombies and Frankenstein's monster, Count Dracula, the Grim Reaper. I don't know if the Grim Reaper is from them, but he's in there for sure. So there are definitely influences from the movies. Akamatsu was also said to be very, very particular about how the controls felt to the players. He wanted to make sure that the controls, the timing of the graphics, and the resulting effects of pressing a button were all very closely aligned. And I know that's common sense and we think about that now, but here in the early days of the Famicom, there really wasn't as much of a push to make the controls tight. They wanted to make games. They didn't really understand all of the consequences of that early on. But Akamatsu did, and he was very keen on making sure that the main character, who's Simon Belmont, to make sure that Simon's movements really felt like an extension of the player's own limbs. And speaking of Simon Belmont, and going back to the fact that Akamatsu was a fan of the movies, Simon's choice of weapon, the whip, is literally a reference to Indiana Jones.
Ah, that's a good reference.
Now, realistically, we don't know much else about the development of Castlevania. Um, Akamatsu has not given many interviews. People who've worked with him, there aren't many. Remember, very small crews. What we have, we've pieced together from other interviews. And unfortunately, the original materials for this game, for all of the Nintendo Castlevanias, were actually lost in the Great Hanshin earthquake of 1995. So we really don't have the historical materials to know much about it other than these little anecdotal bits and pieces that we've kind of got through interviews, the very few interviews that he's given and interviews with other people through the years. So the game was released in September of 1986 for the Famicom in Japan, it was called Akumajo Dracula, and it was instantly successful. Critics loved it. It sold fairly well. And with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Famicom over here in the United States, with the release of the NES on the horizon, they decided that they were going to localize the game for international audiences. The senior vice president of Konami of America was a man named Emil Heidkempf. He was uncomfortable with the religious connotations of the title, which he believed translated to Dracula Satanic Castle. It was kind of close. It does actually translate to Demon Castle Dracula, so pretty darn close. And we know, of course, because we literally talked about it last week. We talk about it week after week after week after week, that Nintendo of America was really trying to market the Nintendo as a family-friendly home console system. So they weren't about to allow instances of blood, of nudity, and especially not, as we talked about last week, religious. Was it last week that we talked about that? What did we talk about last week?
Oh, last week was the episode on.
What did we talk about last week?
I can't think of the damn name right now. I literally was just
Revelations
looking.
is Persona.
Persona.
Yeah. It was Persona, and we talked about how Persona as a series wasn't released in the United States, so it came over to the PlayStation because they didn't want any of the religious connotation from the early Digital Devil stories to be on the Nintendos. So yeah, we did just talk about it last week. But yeah, they didn't want religious imagery, they didn't want blood, they didn't want nudity. So the team brainstormed different names, and what they came up with was putting together Castle and Transylvania, hence Castlevania. So not too much fuss about it. For those of you who don't know, Castlevania tells the story of Simon Belmont, the descendant of a legendary vampire hunter, and he enters the castle of Count Dracula to destroy him when Count Dracula suddenly reappears, like 100 years after Simon's ancestors banish him. Castlevania is a scrolling platformer. You kind of work your way from side to side through 6 blocks of 3 stages each. Like I said, you fight like werewolves and zombies and the Grim Reaper. And at the end, you fight Dracula. And to do so, you use weapons such as the famous whip. There's holy water, there's throwing knives, there's a magical watch that briefly freezes time. So you go through it. Rob, do you have you played these old Castlevania titles?
I've not played any of the old ones. I've not played any of the current ones. I probably may someday play some of the future ones.
So you've never played a Castlevania.
I honestly can't think of having played one, so I have to say no.
Didn't I tell you to buy the Did you end up buying the collection on your Switch?
I did. Oh, so you know what? Okay, I guess I started playing it, and then I think I got frustrated with it.
Gotcha.
That sounds right. I did. I did play it very
A little
briefly.
bit. You played a little
Very
bit.
briefly.
Yeah, you played a little bit.
It's like 20 minutes. So okay, I can't say I played whatever that collection was, but yeah.
I got it. So, well, Akamatsu's team was making, this game, what became known as Castlevania. There was another team at Konami, a completely different, unrelated team, making a game called Vampire Killer for the MSX2, which was a PC based platform over there. It shares the same premise, soundtrack, characters, and locations as Castlevania, but the structure of the game and the game mechanics differ. So instead of a straightforward platforming game, Vampire Killer features labyrinth like stages that require the player to seek out the exit for the next stage and locate a key to unlock the door. Along the way, Simon can pick up items that provide effects such as increasing or decreasing Simon's intelligence. And that affects the price of the merchants for those of you who don't know role playing games, so buying and selling goods. There are stats to provide invulnerability. You can increase your speed. You can jump higher. You can recover health faster. So basically, you have Castlevania with a little bit more exploration and some role playing elements mixed into that traditional Castlevania experience. The one where you battle supernatural forces and slay vampires. Rob, slaying vampires and battling supernatural forces is one thing, but I don't think you know that starting a podcast can be just as exciting.
Really? I mean, I'd love to talk about my lack of Castlevania adventures, but isn't podcasting kind of complicated?
Not with Zencaster. Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that makes it super easy to record high quality audio and video. No need for a fancy studio setup. You can record right from the web browser, and they take care of everything for you.
So, you're telling me I could start recording my vampire slaying podcast from my bedroom with just a browser?
Exactly. And the best part is Zencaster's post-production tools will make sure your podcast sounds crystal clear. They automatically remove background noise, level out your audio, and even cut out all those awkward pauses or filler words. It's like having a professional editor, but with just one click of a mouse.
That sounds too much like magic, Dave. But,
Yeah.
if I did try it, once I've recorded everything, how do I get it out to listeners?
Well, Zencaster's got you covered there too. You can distribute your podcast to all major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts directly from the Zencaster website. It's truly an all in one solution for making podcasting easier than ever.
You're making it sound really easy, Dave. But how can our listeners get started?
It's simple. Just head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane. You'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. So if you've been thinking about starting your own podcast, or maybe you want to take your current one to the next level, Zencaster is the perfect tool.
Well, if it's really that easy, I might finally start my own podcast about all the times I've saved the world from Dracula, and I'll give you a brief history into that. It's
Zero.
none.
There'd be zero episodes on your podcast. Go for it. No, So, listeners, whether you're looking to talk about your favorite games or something else entirely like Rob's going to have to figure out here, now's the time to get started. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code, one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month. Now, let's get back to whipping up more Castlevania fun.
And I'll be sure to bring the holy water.
Yeah. All right. I'm having a little bit of fun with those lately. The success of the first Castlevania has Konami deciding what to do next. In general, the video game industry is in a really weird place about video game sequels because the concept, frankly, was so new to them. There are examples, some of which we've talked in the past. We haven't really done any episodes on them, but we've had this discussion of sequels that are drastically different from the original. A kind of example is Super Mario 2. A serious example is The Legend of Zelda 2, right? These games, Legend of Zelda 2 is nothing like The Legend of Zelda. And what was going on is that companies really weren't sure if the market would tolerate having the same game released over and over and over again. Boy, were they in for a surprise, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they were.
Because now we can just stick a different skin on it and release a new Call of Duty every year.
Yep.
And every year it's the top selling game.
Yeah, figure that one out.
So, but way back when, they didn't know if people would tolerate that. They didn't know if people wanted to buy the same game over and over and over, or if changing the locations or the characters was going to be enough to keep a player's interest in a specific series. So there was this push, very briefly, to release sequels in series that were drastically different from everything that came before it. And the second game in the Castlevania series, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, or Dracula 2 as it's known in Japan, is really no different. Um, Gone is the side scrolling platforming. Now we have nonlinear gameplay, very reminiscent of Metroid. A lot of people ask if Metroid had any influence on the gameplay for people that have worked on or near this project. But Akamatsu has actually called this one out, and he has said that there was another game that they used for reference, and that was a game called The Maze of Gallius as his inspiration. Now, The Maze of Gallius was released in 1987. It's a platform adventure game that features puzzle solving and a world map. They're both features that were literally borrowed by the team to make Simon's Quest. And aside from this nonlinear gameplay, um, there are also role playing elements to Simon's Quest. It has a day and night cycle, whereas enemies are stronger at night. It has towns where you can go into towns and talk to villagers. So there were just a lot of things that were decidedly different about this game. I did not like this game when I was a kid because it was hard. That's another thing they did to it. They made it hard. And to be fair, I struggled with all the nonlinear games when I was. I mean, these came out when I was like, this is 3, so I probably would have played when I was 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. I struggled with all the nonlinear games because I couldn't wrap my head around them as a child at the time. So, like Metroid, I wasn't a fan of as a kid. Simon's Quest here, I wasn't a fan of as a kid. I do remember watching a neighbor beat this one. He was really great at video games, and it was a fun game, very, very different from the original. Akamatsu and his team developed Simon's Quest, and like all these other oddity sequels, like Zelda 2, for instance, They were all released not for the Famicom, but for its add-on, the Famicom Disk System, on August 28th, 1987. We've done a whole episode on the disk system, so if you'd like to learn about it and how it differs from the Famicom itself, what it brought to the table, go check that out. But they released all this sequel for the FDS, and then it gets converted to a cartridge and brought over to the United States. And it's released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in December of 1988. And while to many people it's an anomaly, it's a historical footnote, a fun anomaly in the Castlevania series, the truth is that its legacy moves well beyond that. It's actually cited as a direct inspiration for one of the most beloved games in the Castlevania series, and that would be Castlevania Symphony of the Night. We did an entire episode on Symphony of the Night back in episode 78. That's one of my favorite games of all time, so I had a lot of fun doing that episode. So go check that out if you'd like to learn more about that game, that correlation, and learn about what is, in all honesty, a fantastic game, fantastic addition to the Castlevania series. And then, Rob, let's take it back to the beheading. Another fun historical note about this game. It was the cover subject of the worst cover in the history of the Nintendo Power magazine. So it was the cover story for the very second issue of Nintendo Power. The first issue famously has Mario leaping on it, very iconic. But for the second one, uh, Simon's Quest was the cover story. And so the picture, the cover, has someone dressed up as Simon Belmont holding Dracula's severed head in his hand to his side.
Well, damn, that sounds pretty badass.
It is, but as you can imagine, Nintendo, with its family friendly policy, not thrilled. And
Well,
the
that's probably fair as well.
and so the phone line of this magazine was just ringing off the hook with parents complaining that it gave their children nightmares. Just a side note, I didn't call it the worst cover ever. In a retrospective on like episode or issue 50 of Nintendo Power Magazine, they cited it as their worst cover ever. So I'm just, citing the facts for them. I'm with
In their
you.
50th episode?
50th issue.
Well, yeah, sorry, 50th issue. So, of the first 50,
They felt it was their worst cover ever.
I mean,
I don't know if they ever changed their opinion on that.
I
So
was going to say they probably have a lot more than 50 by now.
yeah, maybe.
I would assume so.
I'm with you. I think that the cover is pretty cool. I don't have any problem with it whatsoever, but of course times have changed. I can understand how it was, controversial at the time because this is submortal combat and the fight over that stuff. They were really not about violence or drugs or blood or anything in video games at the time. That was, later on that we became tolerant. So after that weird round of sequels, pretty much all the manufacturers figured out that gamers were fans of the original games and the original gameplay. So they lost this notion that they had to keep making drastically different games for each subsequent game in the series. So when it came time for Akamatsu and the team to make a third game in the Castlevania series, they made the decision, like so many other developers, to go back to the roots of the series. So no more puzzles, no more exploration, no more role playing elements. The third Castlevania title, Castlevania 3, Dragon's Curse, really goes back to the side scrolling roots of the first Castlevania title. They did try to do some different things with it. It has multiple characters, for instance, multiple paths through the game. So there were some stages that would split. You can go up a cliffside or down into tunnels to get into the castle, and that changed your path through the game. So there were there was some variation on it, but they didn't do the whole non-linear, find puzzles and stuff like that. It was another side-scrolling platformer. At the time, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had just come out, was insanely popular as a video game, so there was a lot of pressure on the team to perform in excess, to exceed the quality of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which drove them. But really, that's it. Aside from that, they put the pieces together. They created this game. They released it in December of 1989. And like I said, aside from this, we don't know much about that period because the earthquake wiped everything out. And also, one more reason now we're getting around to. So, Rob, after Castlevania 3, Akamatsu worked as a programmer on Snake's Revenge, which was that, if you'll recall, because we only vaguely talked about it, it was a weird sequel to Metal Gear, not made by Kojima or pretty much anyone on the original Metal Gear team. You know, they made Metal Gear, and then Konami decided that they wanted to make a sequel without any input by the original team. And it's so bad that it's not even recognized as canon anymore. It's not that it's a bad game. If you didn't call it a Metal Gear game, it'd be a fantastic game, but it just isn't a Metal Gear game. So in hindsight, everyone now recognizes it as a non-canon sequel. Doesn't fit the story of the rest. It's this fun little spin-off, alternate universe, whatever you want to call it. So Akamatsu went from directing Castlevania 3 to being a programmer on Snake's Revenge. And after that, he works as a programmer on an arcade cabinet named Asterix. So if you'll notice, Rob, he went from directing 3 titles to being a programmer on 2 titles, one of which that's okay known, and Asterix really isn't, you know? So what's going on is these games are selling poorly. Castlevania, the original, was a commercial success, but Simon's Quest was not. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse was not. So now at this point, after the success of Castlevania, Akamatsu basically has 2, let's say what Konami considers to be major titles that have failed, that are not commercially successful, that are not bringing money in.
Which
So
ones?
which games are bringing money in?
No, aren't.
Aren't?
Yeah,
Castlevania 2 and 3.
yeah, but which ones aren't?
Okay. So what we know about Akamatsu's career at this point is that he was supposed to direct a baseball game or basketball game called Slam Dunk, but he quit halfway through that project and reportedly began working in one of Konami's game centers, like their arcade centers. Akamatsu later said that Konami placed profits above all else, and developers who weren't creating games that made lots of money were all eventually axed one by one, given the pink slip. And all has been implicitly said, we really do believe now historically that because those 2 games were failures, that Akamatsu was basically given the ultimatum: go work in, this arcade game center or quit. So he took the demotion and he went to work in the game center. But the truth is that he did not work in the game center for very long. He ended up quitting the game center, quitting Konami completely. And that's almost all she wrote for his gaming career, if I'm being honest. Supposedly, he later directed 2 fishing games at a company called Vingtet Systems in the early 2000s, but then he for sure quit the industry soon afterwards and hasn't really been seen or heard from since. So, we have the earthquake of 1995, and we have a director who was essentially, let's say, forced out of the gaming industry, who has no interest in returning to the gaming industry. So, all of the typical avenues that we have to learn about the way the origins of a series, the origins of a game, the history, we don't have them for Castlevania. So there isn't really a whole lot there. There isn't a whole lot to go on.
No, that's very true.
It sucks that like earthquake took it all out. Like we digitize things now, and we manage the preservation of things a little bit differently, although that's a fight with new titles. I think in general, because of collector's editions and behind the scene books and art coffee table books, companies preserve their art and their process differently nowadays. But that wasn't the case back then. We've seen plenty of other episodes where we've literally, like, I think back to Pac-Man, where you can go online right now and you can literally look at the original sketches of Pac-Man and its levels on graphing paper. And the fact that we have those is just so freaking cool. But we don't have any of that for Castlevania here because, there was a whole bunch of materials, historical materials, that were taken out in that earthquake when one of Konami's buildings was destroyed. So it's just a shame. And it goes to show you how important preserving video game history as you're doing it really is. Because we don't think about history as we're doing it.
Yeah, no, I mean, not really. Not in the most part. I guess there could be some people that do, but yeah. Most time you just want to get it out, get it known.
That's exactly right. Now, as we know, this was not the end of the Castlevania series. In fact, we already talked about the fact that we did a whole episode on Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is one of the games that literally defined the Metroidvania genre. It literally is the Vania. But Castlevania never really went away. In just 1993, which was just over 3 years after Castlevania 3 had been released, Konami actually had three different titles in the Castlevania series in development. And Symphony of the Night is the sequel to Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which is one of those three titles. Not too long after, circa 1997, the series incorporated 3D graphics when it transitioned over to the Nintendo 64. They just released the simply titled Castlevania on the Nintendo 64. And then that kind of began a period in which all the new Castlevania titles were developed for handhelds. First for the Game Boy Advance, and then a whole bunch of great ones for the Nintendo DS. These are titles like Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow and Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. And realistically, none of these later handheld titles sold as well as Konami hoped. So, you know what happens then? They either drop a series or they reboot it. In this case, we were lucky enough for a complete reboot, which happened in 2010 with Castlevania Lords of Shadows. And that reboot actually became the best selling Castlevania game in the entire series. So there are actually two sequels to Lords of Shadow. Since then, though, there have been no mainline releases in the Castlevania series. I say mainline because Konami has this business idea right now where they're using their IPs in mobile games and in their slot slash pachinko machines. So I'm sure there's a Castlevania slot machine out there, but there has been no release in a Castlevania series since Lord of Shadows 2, which was a while ago at this point. So who knows what the future brings for the IP. Now, with that being said, there is an excellent animated series plural, on Netflix. Have you watched any of them, Rob?
I cannot say that I have, Dave.
So, I've seen the first one, Castlevania, and it actually adapts Castlevania 3, so it's relevant to today's topic. Eventually, it pulls in backstory and characters from other Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night. They closed that one out, and there's another animated series that I have not started yet called Castlevania Nocturne, and that is actually an adaptation of Rondo of the Blood and Symphony of the Night. So they're working on that. The animated series is excellent. I mean, they're continuing to make them. They wouldn't continue to make them if people didn't like them and wouldn't watch them, you know?
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Um, Somewhere in the history, there are graphic novels, there's a manga or two, so there's plenty of Castlevania material if you're a fan. Plenty, plenty, plenty. So, but one thing to know is that, this Castlevania is very important for gaming history. It it influenced a lot of titles. It literally later titled Symphony of Night literally defined the Metroidvania genre. For a lot of reasons, Castlevania is worth a look at, worth a playthrough, worth some preservation. It's a solid entry in that series. And there are a lot of other games that are attached to it. Of course, we've talked about a bunch of them today. We did episodes on Symphony of the Night. We did episodes of the Famicom Disk System. We looked at episodes on Metal Gear. These are all things we talked about today, which we've done entire episodes on. So, of course, if you'd like to check out any of those old episodes, you can, of course, do so by going to anywhere you can get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anything like that. Or you can go to our website, which is www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
Well, you can find calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come talk to Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. You can also find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong. Each week, we tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, technology. I just find a topic that's relevant to the publication week and I roll with it. While doing so, We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. One of the best parts about doing this podcast is every week when I get to sit down and do my research for my next episode, I learn things. That's my favorite thing, is to learn new things. And I get so excited when I learn something new and I get to teach it to you, our listeners. So it's a fantastic cycle for me of learning and teaching and teaching and learning. And in celebration of that, we like to talk every week about our takeaways from each episode. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, honestly, I'm kind of shocked that there was that episode of Nintendo Power with the someone dressed as Simon with the beheading.
Okay.
Like, that's just knowing how big of a problem that would be when Nintendo being the way they are. Just how did that happen?
Well, Nintendo and Nintendo Power are not the same for starters. That's how.
Well, I mean,
But
yeah, I understand that, but like, you would just think that they would try to keep in line with that if they want to have the name Nintendo in their thing. Otherwise, Nintendo could get little upset and say, use our name. It's over."
yeah, but you gotta understand, this is episode two. Episode one was, I think, about Super Mario Brothers 2. This is so early on that I don't think it was well established that they were did not. It's not like that's something they talked about, right? It's not like they went on the news and were like, "We don't want blood or nudity or anything on our console." They just didn't allow it. End of story. That way they could say they were a family friendly system because they didn't allow it in the first place. No one would even risk finding blood, religion, or nudity on the console. It wasn't even a thing. So I think it's more of a matter of it wasn't talked about, and them not being part of Nintendo didn't think about it. I'm sure they found out very quickly after that cover, to be honest. So
Now, when you put it like that, it takes away from the impact that it had on me.
sorry, but it's
Damn
all
you.
it's all historical context, right?
No, you're right. It's absolutely, but
We talk about it every week because it's so well known, but I legitimately, until video game violence became a thing in Congress, which would have been Mortal Kombat circa 1991, 1992. We've talked about it, I think, in our Wolfenstein and censorship episode, if I remember correctly. Until that was really, Congress brought all the video game people in front of them and was like, hey, like, let's do this. And they established the, rating board, ESRB. It wasn't talked about. And it also just wasn't allowed. It was when they started to loosen those reins to appeal to mature audiences that all this came crashing down on them, because then they had to talk about it.
well,
Fun.
that was it for me. But like you said, with the context, you have to take all that into consideration, and it kind of changes things. But
Yeah, for sure.
still, it's just it was interesting to know. Not thinking about that deep about it, and just that it was a thing. So, but yeah, what about yourself, Dave?
I never knew anything about Akamatsu. I still don't know much about Akamatsu, but he's not a stranger anymore because Castlevania is really all he's done. We haven't really had an excuse to look at him for anything else. And so it's interesting and weird to me finding new people from this time period because we've studied it so extensively. Um, and weird to me that someone who made. I know Castlevania's not huge anymore, but I still think it's one of the more recognizable video game franchises historically. And it's weird to know that it exists and the people aren't well known. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of think it does.
Yeah. So, all right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
Just as always, I want to take one quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means a lot, and we hope you enjoy. So thank you.
We sure do. Well, that brings us to the end of our adventure through the haunted halls of Castlevania. We've explored the origins of this legendary franchise, the impact it's had on action platformers, and how the eternal battle between the Belmont clan and Dracula has captivated players for years, starting back here in the 80s. From its iconic whip cracking gameplay to the evolution into the Metroidvania genre, Castlevania, as I said, has earned its place as one of gaming's most influential series. We hope you've enjoyed revisiting this classics with us, and learn something new about their rich history. Next week, though, we're leaving behind the Gothic castles and we're diving into a world of ambitious innovation when we go and look at the 3DO interactive multiplayer. It was a console that promised to revolutionize the gaming industry, but really struggled to find its footing. We'll explore its high tech features, its rocky launch, and what ultimately led to its downfall. So join us next week as we learn another one of those what could have been stories on yet another trip down memory card lane. To the thing.
Skibidi dap 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 doo doo.